Julius Klinger was born in Dornbach, just outside Vienna in 1876, into a prosperous Jewish family. But although his talent for all things artistic was obvious in his childhood, he went on in his later teens to study mathematics, engineering, and technical drawing at the city's technological trade school. In 1895, when he was 19 years old, he met the influential artist and designer Koloman Moser, who helped Klinger to become an illustrator for the humour magazine Meggendorfer Blätter. This necessitated a move to Munich in southeast Germany, where Meggendorfer's offices and studio were based. But it was an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss, and within a year of his arrival in the city, he was also working occasionally for the hugely influential and respected Munich arts magazine Jugend. After a couple of years in Munich, he relocated again, this time to Berlin, and although his association with Meggendorfer ended at this point, he did continue to be published in Jugend for a few more years. The term graphic design had not yet been created and wouldn't be until the 1920s, so the discipline was generally known as applied art. And in 1901 he collaborated with the artist and designer Hans Anker to create and publish a portfolio of graphic decorative devices as an effective style guide of good practice to promote the principles of Jugendstil, the Germanic version of Art Nouveau. It proved to be a considerable success, and a year later he produced another, featuring similarly stylized images of the female figure, for no apparent reason other than as pure decoration. But as anyone with even a passing knowledge of the applied art of the period knows, it was the classical beauty of the female figure which adorned virtually every aspect of popular culture, from posters, books and magazines through to textiles and architectural decoration in all its forms. But most significantly, he was among a handful of other talented contemporaries to sign a contract with the printers Hollerbaum and Schmidt, and in that capacity he soon proved to be arguably the most popular and frequently commissioned poster designer associated with the company's output. This professional relationship would endure to their mutual benefit for quite a few years to come, but even within the first few years of their association, the volume and range of illustrated posters he produced was prodigious, and the varied commissions provided Klinger with the opportunity to practice and refine the principles of good design that he had already acquired and would continue to explore. But rather ironically, having begun his working life within the stylistic parameters of Jugendstil and becoming a respected exponent in its use, almost immediately and apparently overnight, Klinger moved away from that generally organic decorative approach into more overtly modernist and minimalist territory. Along with a couple of his contemporaries, Lucien Bernhard and Hans Rudiert, he became widely known and admired for a more radical graphic style, which was quickly christened Plakatstil, which translates literally as poster style. And in a world somewhat overfond of labelling every nuance in art, whether applied or otherwise, Plakatstil also embraced the subgenre Sackplakat, German for object poster. Klinger and his fellow practitioners weren't the first to explore this territory, which typically employed simple shapes created with bold outlines and limited palettes of flat colour, now referred to as the widely used technique of posterisation. They'd all been strongly influenced by the earlier posters of the late 19th century British partnership known as the Beggarstaff Brothers, and some Americans such as Will Bradley. Nevertheless, the three of them set about revolutionising poster design in Germany and Austria, and they and the modernist styling they had introduced remained dominant for decades to come. Klinger's many clients were drawn from all strands of commercial activity, and he applied his graphic consideration to all manner of subjects, from the most mundane of household items through to worthy dramatic productions and prestigious luxury products. Some, such as the humour magazine Lustige Blätter, became closely associated with the images he created and turned into quite long-running advertising campaigns. And although his graphic approach was deliberately undecorated and radically simple in its adherence to the broad principles of Plakatstil, Klinger was particularly fond of creating images which were possessed of both humour and humanity, not to mention a good measure of surrealism, another term yet to be created. and in that regard he was conspicuous among his more straight-faced colleagues as a creator of more memorably entertaining images. The reputation Klinger had by now established for the commercial potency of his posters led to regular appearances in the pages of German Art and Decoration, a respected journal of both fine and applied arts. And the pure monochrome images published there also revealed the significant, if harshly geometric influence of the pen drawings of Aubrey Beardsley, not particularly evident in his other work. And although these drawings pushed hard at the boundaries of how far illustration could travel into abstracted territory, they still managed to retain a certain humanity in the figures depicted. But the posters kept on coming as the end of the decade grew closer, and although there was considerable variety in the images produced, they collectively transformed the popular concept of what a poster should look like, with the obvious message that less was indeed very much more if executed with panache and visual consideration. But even though more than gainfully occupied with his poster work, in 1909 he did find time to produce an illustrated limited edition involving more nodding towards Beardsley's work and subject matter of only 35 copies of the sexually explicit tale of Sodom, written by the Earl of Rochester in 1684. But Klinger's images were so very mannered that other than the odd little cheeky moment, it would have been hard to condemn the work as obscene. But Klinger never really showed more than a passing interest in narrative work, and as the second decade of the century began, it continued to be with posters and the enduring popularity of Plakatstiel itself that he enjoyed considerable continued success. As a reflection of the respect he had acquired through his groundbreaking work, he was offered prestigious teaching posts at both the Rhineman Art School and the Berlin School for Decorative Arts. But despite these additional academic roles, Klinger not only continued to produce posters for Hollerbaum and Schmidt, but did so at a level of apparently even greater productivity than previously. And not only were they many in number, but the posters he designed were a persistent, clear demonstration of the apparently bottomless resources of aesthetic graphic prowess and imagination he possessed. It was also around the turn of the decade that among the many and varied topics he was commissioned to evoke, the subject of aeroplane flight became a dominant strand of his poster work. And it seems that, as with much of the Western world, Germans had quickly become fascinated by the idea of travel by air, and many displays were organised, with Klinger creating numerous visually agreeable and quietly witty images to promote the events. Klinger had little time for the egotism and self-importance of many of his fellow visual creatives. Writing in an arts journal in 1912, he set out his own view of commercial art and design as follows: "We want to produce our work well and with purpose, so that it not only unburdens our conscience, but also fulfills its intended function as a part of life. We do not consider ourselves divinely gifted artists." And with this refusal to see commercial graphics as anything to do with the art world, but as a thriving creative industry in its own right, Klinger continued to put the needs of his clients and their intended customers first, with a series of illustrated posters which were simple, eloquent, and popular with clients and the public alike. Plakatstiel, as developed and popularised by Klinger and other like-minded illustrators and designers, worked in particularly close symbiosis with the process of traditional lithographic printing, not least due to the predominance of its preference for flat colour and limited palettes. None of Klinger's images were reproduced directly from painted work, but were created with a series of precise graphic shapes for each colour run of the palette used. And despite the large volume of his work that's available, there isn't a single surviving example of a sketch or coloured maquette of any of his posters. When war was declared in 1914, Klinger was 38 years old and was not expected to fight in the army. And while many of his students marched dutifully off to their likely deaths, he continued to create posters throughout. All of which, with only a couple of exceptions, such as this neoclassical example, and possibly this stirring maritime image for the serialization of a novel, ignored the conflict altogether. And the only even remotely propagandist image he created was this rather prophetic dragon in its death throes for a 1918 bid to urge the public to buy war bonds. Otherwise, the posters he produced during the war were as upbeat and lightly humorous as those he'd been producing before it had begun. When the war ended with the defeat of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Klinger began work on a significantly groundbreaking, comprehensive and enduring advertising campaign promoting the taboo company's cigarette filters and rolling paper. There were many press ads and posters created, some of which were staunchly frivolous in their pictorial content, and as many others which used languid female characters to glamorize the product. But there were just as many that relied entirely on the radical nature of their pure design and typographic power. But the campaign went way beyond the usual expectations too, with huge billboards and even painted sides of buildings and construction site fencing. And unlike other ad campaigns of the period, particularly in Britain and the USA, it was completely without any sloganeering or sales pitch. Klinger continued to work in academic roles during the 1920s, and in 1922 and 23 he worked with a handful of his more able students, all of whom were profoundly influenced by his teaching, to produce a portfolio of mostly spurious poster designs using only black and red. Quite a few were by Klinger himself as the star attraction of the project, but his students created equally radical and amusing designs, which I confess on first seeing I actually thought were by Klinger. The purpose of the exercise was to publish the collection in the USA in the hope of making inroads into the vast potential of the commercial market there. But sadly for Klinger and his disciples, other than some praise from American academics, the USA could not have been less interested, and it failed to achieve its purpose. But the collection was simultaneously published in Vienna, where it enjoyed more popularity, even if it could be accused of preaching to the already converted. By the middle of the 1920s, Klinger had returned to Vienna, and although he continued to design posters, the evidence of his work from this time suggests that he was increasingly creating illustrations for both German and Austrian magazines. Among them was Die Musketeer, usually known for its left-leaning political stance, and more frivolous publications such as the fashion magazine Wiener Mode and Mocker, a general interest magazine. It was also at this time that, somewhat unexpectedly, he channeled his creativity into the design and production of a series of amusing wooden toys for children, which, despite their overtly geometric construction, were both endearing and popular. Predictably, they are now collector's items for those who can afford them. In 1928, Klinger was invited by General Motors to the USA to discuss an ad campaign, which never transpired. But a year later he did work for the London Underground with the creation of this remarkable pair of posters using his strange but highly expressive blend of geometry and poker-faced humour. As the 1920s turned to the 30s, Klinger had become less involved with posters, but concentrated more on magazine illustration and on his role as an academic. And he additionally taught all aspects of graphics at the Applied Arts School in Magdeburg in Germany. He even returned briefly to the USA in 1931 as a guest lecturer at an unnamed art school in New York. And with hindsight, it was a pity that he didn't stay there. The rise of the National Socialists and their virulent anti-Semitism was mirrored in much of Austria, and throughout the 1930s life became increasingly difficult for Klinger. What little evidence there is by him from this time indicates he was turning increasingly to typographic solutions. But in 1938, when Austria was annexed by Germany, he was unable to work in any capacity. In 1942, he and his wife paid the ultimate price for being born Jewish when they were put on a train for a concentration camp, and they died not much later when he was 66 years old. None of these videos could be said to have a happy ending, as it's always the death of the subject which brings them to a close. But the tragic ending to Klinger's life, being killed for the sin of being Jewish, hits hard at the soul of any sentient human being. But as always, I'll try to park that depressing thought about humanity's apparently infinite capacity for ideological brutality deeper down, and end with some more of Klinger's remarkable contribution to pictorial graphic design. And as always, I'll hope that this short film about his life and work brings him to the attention of at least a few more people, and greater recognition for that contribution.